Good morning, Liberty family. Today I'm going to discuss the databases that we were assigned this week for week 5, in particular the American Historical and Life database, as well as the Historical Imprints database, given that my topic does have European implications. Focusing specifically on the German POWs in Michigan, searches within both databases only gave very limited results. Surprisingly, when I went very broad and said German POWs, or German prisoners of war, more sources appeared, and both databases had matching sources, and one source in particular focused on Michigan. Kevin Hall wrote a journal article in 2015 for the Michigan Historical Review, which is a journal article given and published through the Central Michigan University here in Michigan. He was a doctoral student at the time, and he focused on the German prisoners of war. His article, entitled "The Befriended Enemy, German Prisoners of War in Michigan," looked at the camps, and he also looked at a number of letters that the German prisoners had written back to American farmers. His paper was a very heavy influence on mine as I started finding letters of my own. Within his methodology, not only did he look at letters, he went to the local historical societies, he discussed at the local camp individuals who remembered things, and his argument simply was that even though there were rules against fraternization, it was very common here for the farmers to actually break that. They would give clothing, food, encouragement, talk about their lives, their families back in Germany, etc. Following that, Arnold Kramer from Texas A&M University wrote a journal periodical entitled "German Prisoners of War in the United States," and his argument was essentially to state that the United States is very unprepared to take on the number of prisoners that we did. And it was true. We didn't have facilities built. We weren't planning on having hundreds of thousands of people to inter. But he does a very good job pulling from a lot of the military sources, from the Secretary Henry Stimpton, who was in charge of the camp, and giving an overview of what camp life was like for the POWs. POWs were not just something that the United States discussed, was not something that just England and Russia were involved in. Interestingly enough, the United States actually hadn't sat down with Canada, who I will admit I did forget was an ally during World War II. They're not heavily mentioned. And with Jean-Michel Turcot, and to have a friendly cooperation between Canadians and Americans, the Canada-United States relationships regarding German prisoners of war, 1940 to 1945, went back through Canadian and American military records to discuss that the two groups did sit down, did set up very similar policies and how they were going to treat, care, and house all of these POWs that were being sent in. So some were actually sent up to Canada instead of just into the United States, which that could be another avenue in which to take my dissertation, or at least add a chapter. Unfortunately, if these sources are not translated into English, I do not have the ability to read French. So that is something I will have to take into consideration. Matthias Rees had an additional publication, and he and Barbara Heisler, both of whom who have mentioned previously within their articles, were found in these databases. However, Barbara Heisler's "Returning to America" was only found in the Historical Imprints database, not in the American database. And Barbara focused on looking at the prisoners of war and those who came back at war's end with encouragement from the American farmers that they had contacted. America had had so much influence on them, and they loved the country so much they decided to immigrate once the war ended. And Matthias looked at it from a completely different standpoint. He had noticed the letters that the German POWs sent home, and even their personal testimonies, which he did look at, indicated that the United States treated some of their soldiers very different to how the POWs were treated, in particular the African American soldiers. At the time, the United States Army was segregated, and because the German POWs had quote unquote white skin or had white ethnicity, they qualified for getting good rations, getting good food, riding in front of train cars for transportation purposes, whereas the African Americans were put to the back of the cars, as was very common at the time. With all of these articles, though, there is a very common thread of how they got their sources and the methodologies that they used, utilizing primary sources of letters, government documents, the National Archives, military records, personal testimonies, if those are available. But there is an underlying theme of positive treatment as well, which all of these articles do bring forth. I hope you all have a great week, and I look forward to talking to you again.